The first time anyone noticed the toy, it didn't seem important. It was just a small, broken stuffed rabbit with one missing ear and faded blue stitching, lying quietly at the bottom of a trash bag in the corner of the playroom. The Harrison family was preparing for their annual house cleaning, a tradition Mrs. Harrison proudly followed every spring. Old clothes, worn-out decorations, and forgotten items were carefully sorted and thrown away to make space for new memories. The house buzzed with movement as workers carried boxes down the marble staircase, and the children ran to the halls deciding which toys they had outgrown. Everything seemed perfectly normal, until the maid refused to throw away that one broken toy. Her name was Elena, and she had worked for the Harrison family for nearly 7 years. She was known for being quiet, hardworking, and incredibly respectful. She rarely spoke unless spoken to, and she carried out her duties with gentle care that made her almost invisible in the busy household. The family trusted her completely. She cooked their meals, cleaned their rooms, and helped look after their 2 young children, Oliver and Sophie. To the Harrisons, she was reliable, loyal, and predictable. That was why what happened that afternoon felt so strange. Mrs. Harrison stood in the doorway of the playroom, holding a clipboard filled with items marked for donation or disposal. She watched as Elena carefully opened the black trash bag, reached inside, and slowly pulled out the damaged stuffed rabbit. The toy was clearly beyond repair. Its stuffing peeked out through torn seams, and its once bright fabric had dulled with age. Mrs. Harrison calmly told Elena to place it back in the trash, assuming she had simply made a mistake. But instead of following the instruction, Elena held the toy close to her chest, her hands trembling slightly. For a moment, the room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Oliver and Sophie paused their laughter, watching the unusual exchange. Mrs. Harrison repeated her request, this time more firmly, reminding Elena that the toy was broken and no longer safe for children. Elena nodded politely, but she didn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on the rabbit, as if it held something far more valuable than anyone else could see. The hesitation confused Mrs. Harrison. In all the years Elena had worked there, she had never questioned a single instruction. Mr. Harrison soon entered the room after hearing the rising tension. He tried to lighten the moment with a small joke, suggesting they could easily replace the toy with a brand new one. After all, the children already had dozens of stuffed animals waiting on their shelves. But Elena's reaction wasn't what anyone expected. Her face paled, and she shook her head quietly, whispering that the toy could not be thrown away. Her voice was soft, but there was a deep emotion behind it that made the entire room feel heavier. The children looked confused, and Mrs. Harrison felt a flicker of irritation mixed with curiosity. Why would a simple broken toy matter so much to someone who had no personal connection to it? As Mrs. Harrison stepped closer, she noticed something unusual stitched into the toy's remaining ear, something she had never seen before. She reached out to examine it, but Elena quickly pulled the rabbit back, fear flashing across her face for the first time since she had joined their family. And in that moment, the Harrisons realized this wasn't just about a damaged toy. It was about a secret Elena had been hiding inside their home for years, a truth that was about to change everything they believed about trust, loyalty, and the quiet woman they thought they knew so well. Mrs. Harrison slowly lowered her hand, her eyes narrowing as she studied Elena's frightened expression. The room felt unusually quiet, as if even the ticking clock on the hallway wall had softened its sound. Elena clutched the broken stuffed rabbit tightly against her uniform, her knuckles turning pale from the pressure. Mr. Harrison exchanged a glance with his wife, both silently trying to understand why their calm and obedient housemaid was suddenly acting so protective over an old toy that clearly belonged in the trash. "Elena, it's just a toy," Mrs. Harrison said gently this time, trying to keep her voice calm instead of strict. "If it means something to the children, we can buy them a new one. There's no need to hold on to something broken." Elena swallowed nervously, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak, but couldn't find the courage. Oliver stepped closer, tilting his head in confusion. "That used to be my favorite rabbit when I was little," he said quietly, "but I thought we lost it years ago." Sophie nodded, brushing her long hair behind her ear. "Mom, I remember Oliver used to sleep with it every night," she added. "But it disappeared when we moved to the new wing of the house." Mrs. Harrison frowned slightly, surprised by the children's memories. She clearly remembered buying Oliver a brand new stuffed bear around that time to replace a toy he claimed to have lost. She had assumed the rabbit had simply been misplaced during one of their renovations. She looked back at Elena, curiosity growing stronger than her frustration. "Where did you find it?" Mr. Harrison asked calmly, folding his arms as he leaned against the doorframe. His voice wasn't angry, but it carried the weight of someone who expected a truthful answer. Elena hesitated, her eyes moving between the family members standing around her. It was in one of the storage boxes in the attic," she said softly. "I was organizing old decorations this morning when I saw it." Mrs. Harrison nodded slowly, but something about Elena's tone didn't sit right with her. The maid had always been honest and direct, but now her words sounded careful, almost rehearsed. Mrs. Harrison stepped closer, noticing how Elena subtly turned her body away, shielding the toy from view. That small movement only deepened her suspicion. "You could have simply placed it with the donation items," Mrs. Harrison said, keeping her voice steady. "You've sorted hundreds of old things for us before. Why is this toy different?" Elena's eyes filled with emotion, though she quickly blinked it away. "Some things shouldn't be thrown away," she whispered. The answer felt incomplete, hanging in the air without explanation. Oliver and Sophie exchanged glances, sensing the tension growing between the adults. Mr. Harrison straightened his posture, his patience beginning to thin, though he still tried to remain reasonable. "Elena," he said firmly but not harshly, "you've been part of this household for a long time. If there's a reason you want to keep the toy, you can tell us. But refusing a simple request without explanation is unusual for you." Elena lowered her gaze to the rabbit, gently running her fingers over the torn stitching, as if remembering something painful. The small gesture didn't go unnoticed by Mrs. Harrison, who suddenly realized that this toy wasn't just important to the children. It seemed deeply personal to Elena herself. That thought raised even more questions. Elena had never spoken much about her life before working for the Harrisons. She had arrived through a trusted agency, with excellent references and a quiet promise to work hard and never cause trouble. Mrs. Harrison remembered how Elena rarely took time off, rarely received phone calls, and never spoke about family or friends. At the time, she had admired the maid's dedication. Now, standing in the playroom watching her hold the broken rabbit like a fragile memory, Mrs. Harrison felt a strange unease settle in her chest. "What aren't you telling us?" Mrs. Harrison asked softly. Elena's breathing became uneven, and for a brief moment, it looked like she might finally speak. But before she could answer, a sudden loud crash echoed from upstairs, startling everyone in the room. Sophie gasped. Oliver rushed toward the hallway, and Mr. Harrison quickly turned toward the staircase. In the confusion, Elena instinctively stepped back, pressing the toy even closer to her heart. And as Mrs. Harrison glanced back at her, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Tiny initials carefully sewn into the rabbit's torn seam, initials that didn't match either of her children's names. Mrs. Harrison's eyes stayed fixed on the tiny initials stitched into the torn seam of the rabbit as the noise upstairs continued to echo through the mansion. The letters were small and slightly uneven, as if they had been sewn by hand rather than by machine. They clearly didn't spell Oliver or Sophie. A quiet chill moved through her chest as questions rushed into her mind. Before she could ask anything, Mr. Harrison called out from the staircase, asking the children to stay downstairs while he went to check what had fallen. Oliver and Sophie hovered near the hallway, whispering nervously to each other. The sudden crash had shaken the calm atmosphere of their home, but Mrs. Harrison's attention remained locked on Elena. The maid still held the toy tightly, her breathing slow but unsteady. Mrs. Harrison stepped closer, lowering her voice so the children wouldn't hear. "Elena, those initials," she said carefully. "Who do they belong to?" Elena's shoulders stiffened. For a moment, she said nothing. Her eyes stared at the rabbit, as if she was deciding whether to speak or stay silent. The silence stretched long enough to make Mrs. Harrison's concern grow stronger. She had always believed her home was built on trust. Every employee, every helper, every person who stepped inside those walls was expected to be honest. Yet right now, standing just inches away from her, Elena looked like someone carrying a secret far heavier than a simple childhood toy. I fixed it once, Elena finally said, her voice barely louder than a whisper. It was already torn when I found it. Mrs. Harrison noticed how carefully Elena chose her words again. She wasn't lying, but she also wasn't telling the full truth. Down the hallway, the sound of Mr. Harrison moving furniture upstairs could be heard, followed by the faint scrape of something being dragged across the floor. The strange interruption only made the moment feel more tense. Sophie slowly walked back into the playroom, curiosity shining in her eyes. "Elena, why are you crying?" she asked innocently. Elena quickly wiped the corner of her eye, forcing a small smile. "I'm not, sweetheart. Just dust from cleaning," she replied softly. But the excuse sounded weak, even to herself. Oliver crossed his arms, studying the rabbit closely. "I remember when it disappeared," he said. "I looked everywhere for it. I thought someone threw it away." He glanced at his parents. "I was really sad that day." Mrs. Harrison's heart softened hearing her son's words, but her mind kept circling back to Elena's reaction. Something didn't match. If the toy had been lost years ago and only recently found in the attic, why did Elena react like it carried a personal memory rather than just a forgotten belonging? Mr. Harrison soon returned downstairs, brushing dust off his sleeves. "Just an old shelf collapsing in the storage hallway," he said, reassuring the children. But as he stepped into the playroom, he immediately sensed a heavy silence between his wife and Elena. Mrs. Harrison leaned slightly toward him and quietly mentioned the initials. Mr. Harrison's expression shifted from calm curiosity to quiet seriousness. He studied the toy carefully, noticing how worn it was, as if it had been held and repaired multiple times. His attention moved back to Elena, whose grip on the rabbit hadn't loosened for a second. "Elena," he said gently but firmly, "this is becoming more than just a house cleaning issue. If this toy connects to something important, we need to understand why." Elena opened her mouth as if she was ready to explain, but her words stopped before they formed. Her eyes drifted toward the staircase, then toward the hallway window where the evening sky had started turning gray. It almost looked like she was afraid of something beyond the conversation itself. Mrs. Harrison noticed a shift in her behavior and followed her gaze. For a brief moment, she wondered if Elena feared losing her job or facing punishment for hiding something. But deep inside, Mrs. Harrison sensed it was something else, something older and far more painful. As the tension lingered, Sophie quietly picked up a photo album lying on the playroom table, one the family had been sorting earlier during the house cleaning. She flipped through the pages absent-mindedly until she suddenly paused. Her small fingers traced over one particular photograph, her eyebrows pulling together in confusion. "Mom," Sophie said slowly, holding up the picture. "Who is this little girl standing next to Oliver in this photo? And why is she holding the same rabbit?" Mrs. Harrison's breath caught as Sophie held the photograph out in front of her. The room seemed to grow colder, quieter, as every pair of eyes shifted toward the picture. Mrs. Harrison slowly stepped forward and took it from her daughter's hands. The image showed a much younger Oliver standing in the garden during his 5th birthday party. Balloons floated in the background, and a large cake sat on the outdoor table. But Mrs. Harrison's attention locked onto the small girl standing beside Oliver, smiling shyly while holding the same stuffed rabbit that Elena now clutched tightly against her chest. Mrs. Harrison stared at the photo, her mind racing. She searched her memory, trying to place the child's face, but the image felt like a faded dream she couldn't fully recall. She glanced at her husband, silently asking if he remembered. Mr. Harrison leaned closer, studying the photograph with growing confusion. He shook his head slowly, signaling that he didn't recognize the girl either. "Who is she?" Oliver asked, stepping closer. "I don't remember her, but it looks like she was at my party." Sophie moved beside her brother, curiosity mixing with unease. "And she's holding the rabbit," she added softly. Mrs. Harrison turned toward Elena, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to stay calm. "Elena, why does this girl have the toy? And why are her initials stitched into it?" Elena's face had turned pale, her eyes glistening as she stared at the photograph from across the room. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The rabbit in her hand shook slightly as her fingers tightened around its worn fabric. The tension inside the playroom felt almost unbearable, pressing against every wall, every breath. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, his tone steady but serious. "Elena, this photo was taken years before you started working for us. If you recognize this girl, you need to tell us. This isn't just about a broken toy anymore." Elena closed her eyes briefly, as if fighting a storm of memories. When she opened them again, they looked filled with fear and sorrow that none of them had ever seen in her before. She glanced toward the front windows of the mansion, where the evening sky had darkened further, heavy clouds slowly gathering. The distant rumble of thunder rolled across the horizon, adding to the suffocating atmosphere inside the house. "I didn't mean for any of this to come back," Elena whispered, her voice fragile. Mrs. Harrison's heart pounded faster. "Come back from what?" she asked quietly. Before Elena could respond, a sudden sharp knock echoed from the front door. The unexpected sound made Sophie jump, while Oliver instinctively moved closer to his parents. The knock came again, louder this time, urgent and demanding attention. Mr. Harrison frowned, glancing toward the entrance hallway. They weren't expecting visitors, especially not during a storm that was quickly approaching. "I'll see who it is," Mr. Harrison said cautiously, though he hesitated for a brief moment, sensing how fragile the situation in the room had become. He walked toward the door, his footsteps echoing through the marble hallway as the rest of the family remained frozen in place. Elena's breathing grew heavier, and she slowly backed away from the center of the playroom, as if she wanted to disappear. Mrs. Harrison noticed the fear returning to her expression, stronger than before. It was no longer just emotional pain. It looked like genuine panic. "Elena," Mrs. Harrison said gently, stepping closer, "are you afraid of whoever is at that door?" Elena didn't answer directly, but her silence spoke louder than words. Her eyes moved toward the hallway, listening to the sound of Mr. Harrison unlocking the door. The wind outside howled faintly, followed by the creaking sound of the front entrance opening. From where they stood, they couldn't see who had arrived, but they could hear a low, unfamiliar voice speaking to Mr. Harrison. The tone sounded calm, yet strangely firm, like someone who had come with a purpose. Mrs. Harrison felt a deep unease settle in her stomach as she noticed Elena clutch the rabbit so tightly that a small tear widened along its fragile seam. Footsteps began moving toward the playroom. Slow, steady, intentional. Oliver and Sophie instinctively stepped behind their mother. Mrs. Harrison's pulse raced as she turned toward the doorway, bracing herself for whoever was about to enter. Elena's entire body trembled now, her eyes locked on the entrance as if she already knew what was coming. And as the shadow of a tall figure stretched across the hallway floor and reached the edge of the playroom door, Elena whispered something so quietly that only Mrs. Harrison, standing closest to her, could hear. They finally found it. Mrs. Harrison barely had time to process Elena's whisper before the figure stepped fully into the playroom. The man looked to be in his late 40s, dressed in a dark overcoat dampened by the storm outside. Rainwater dripped slowly from the edge of his sleeves onto the polished wooden floor. His expression was calm, almost polite, but his eyes carried a sharp focus that immediately made the room feel smaller. Mr. Harrison followed closely behind him, his face tense and confused. "He says he needs to speak with us about a missing personal item," Mr. Harrison explained carefully, clearly unsure whether to treat the visitor as a guest or something more concerning. The man's gaze slowly moved across the family until it landed on Elena. The moment their eyes met, Elena's grip on the broken stuffed rabbit tightened again. Her breathing grew shallow, and she took a small step backward, nearly bumping into the bookshelf behind her. Mrs. Harrison felt a sudden protective instinct rise inside her, stepping slightly in front of her children without even thinking. "I believe that toy belongs to me," the man said calmly, his voice steady and measured. The word sent a ripple of shock through the room. Oliver looked confused. Sophie clutched her mother's arm, and Mr. Harrison frowned deeply. Mrs. Harrison glanced at Elena, expecting her to deny the claim immediately, but Elena remained silent, her eyes filled with fear and something that looked like guilt. "I'm sorry," Mr. Harrison said cautiously, "but this toy belongs to our family. It was my son's childhood stuffed rabbit." The man nodded slowly, as if he had expected that response. "It may have stayed in your home for many years," he replied, "but its history began long before that." Mrs. Harrison felt her heart pound harder. The room seemed to tilt slightly under the weight of the man's words. She turned toward Elena again, searching her face for answers, but Elena's expression only grew more distressed. The storm outside intensified, thunder rolling across the sky as rain began striking the windows harder, adding to the heavy tension building inside the house. "What do you mean by that?" Mrs. Harrison asked, her voice steady but cautious. The man reached into his coat pocket and slowly pulled out a folded photograph, holding it carefully between his fingers. He stepped forward and placed it on the playroom table. Mr. Harrison picked it up first, his expression shifting as he studied the image. Mrs. Harrison leaned closer, her breath catching as she saw what it showed. The photograph was old and slightly faded, but the picture was clear enough to recognize. It showed the same little girl from the birthday photo Sophie had found earlier. She was sitting on a hospital bed, smiling softly while holding the same stuffed rabbit. Standing beside her was a man now standing in their playroom, his arm gently resting on the child's shoulder. "That is my daughter," the man said quietly, "and that rabbit was the last gift I gave her before she disappeared." The word disappeared hung heavily in the air, sending a wave of shock through the family. Mrs. Harrison slowly turned toward Elena again, her mind struggling to piece together the growing mystery. Oliver and Sophie stared at the photograph with wide eyes, clearly sensing the seriousness of the moment. Mr. Harrison's voice lowered, cautious but firm. "Are you saying your daughter was here? In this house?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Elena. "I've spent years searching," he said slowly, following records, photos, and small clues that never made sense until recently. And every trail led back to one place, this family and her. He raised his hand slightly, pointing toward Elena without breaking his calm tone. Elena's legs trembled, and she struggled to stay standing. Mrs. Harrison felt her chest tighten as fear and confusion collided inside her. She couldn't understand how her quiet, loyal maid could possibly be connected to a missing child or a mystery stretching back years before Elena even worked in their home. "Elena," Mrs. Harrison whispered, her voice filled with both disbelief and urgency. "What is he talking about?" Tears finally slipped down Elena's cheeks as she looked at the broken toy in her hands. Her fingers gently traced the stitched initials once more, as if the small letters carried memories she could no longer hide from. The storm outside roared louder, rattling the windows as if the house itself felt the pressure of the moment. And just as Elena opened her mouth to speak, the man reached into his coat again and pulled out another item, a thin, worn envelope sealed with a faded wax stamp. He placed it slowly onto the table beside the photograph. "This," he said quietly, "was found in an old case file reopened last month. It was addressed to someone inside this house, and it was never delivered." Mrs. Harrison stared at the envelope, her pulse racing as she noticed a familiar handwritten name written across the front. Mrs. Harrison's hands trembled as she slowly picked up the worn envelope from the table. The faded ink of the handwritten name made her heart pound harder with every second she stared at it. The letter was addressed to her, written in careful, uneven handwriting that looked like it belonged to a child. The wax seal was cracked with age, but it had never been opened. A deep, uneasy silence filled the playroom as every person waited for her to react. I've never seen this before," Mrs. Harrison whispered, her voice unsteady as she turned the envelope over in her hands. Her mind raced, searching through years of memories, birthdays, parties, renovations, and staff changes. Nothing prepared her for this moment. The man stepped closer, his expression still calm, but carrying years of quiet pain. "The letter was found inside my daughter's belongings," he said softly. "Investigators believe she tried to send it before she vanished. It was meant for someone she trusted, someone she thought could help her." Mrs. Harrison slowly broke the old seal, her fingers shaking as she unfolded the fragile paper inside. The handwriting was small and uneven, clearly written by a young child. As her eyes moved across the page, her breathing grew shallow. "Dear Mrs. Harrison," she read quietly, her voice barely steady enough to continue. "Thank you for letting me play in your garden. Oliver shared his cake with me, and Sophie gave me her crayons. I wish I could stay longer. I'm scared to go back home sometimes. Elena says she will protect me, but she also looks scared. If I don't come back, please don't forget me. And please take care of Bunny for me." The final words made Mrs. Harrison's voice crack. The room felt like it had stopped breathing altogether. Oliver and Sophie stared at their mother in shock, while Mr. Harrison's face turned pale as he slowly connected the pieces. Mrs. Harrison lowered the letter and turned toward Elena, tears forming in her eyes. "You knew her," she whispered. Elena finally broke. She sank to her knees, clutching the broken stuffed rabbit as quiet sobs escaped her chest. Years of silence, fear, and hidden memories poured out in that moment. "She was my niece," Elena cried softly. "Her name was Marisol. Her parents, they were struggling. They moved often, and she spent time staying with me when she could. One day, I brought her here while I was helping clean during a party. She was so happy playing with Oliver and Sophie. It was the first time I saw her feel safe." The man closed his eyes briefly, grief and relief mixing across his face as he listened. "Elena, what happened to her?" Mr. Harrison asked gently, though the question carried heavy weight. Elena wiped her tears, her voice trembling. "Her family suddenly left town. I tried to stay in contact, but I lost them. Months later, I heard she was missing. I searched everywhere, but I was too afraid to tell anyone I had brought her here. I thought I would lose my job, and I was ashamed I couldn't protect her." The man stepped forward, his voice filled with emotion. "She wasn't taken because of you," he said quietly. "She ran away from home." Authorities confirmed she was found months later and placed into a safe care program under a new identity for protection. "I found her years later, safe, but she barely remembered her early childhood. All she remembered clearly was this house, this family, and that toy." Mrs. Harrison gasped softly, relief washing over her, but Elena's sobs only deepened. "I kept the rabbit because it was the only proof she was ever here," Elena said. "I repaired it again and again because I promised her I would never let it disappear." The man nodded slowly. "I reopened her old records recently, hoping to return pieces of her past. When I saw photos linking her to this home, I knew I had come here." The tension in the room slowly softened as years of mystery finally came together. Oliver and Sophie stepped closer, their young faces filled with emotion. Sophie gently touched Elena's shoulder, while Oliver looked at the worn toy with new understanding. Mrs. Harrison carefully folded the letter, tears slipping down her cheeks as she looked at Elena. "You should have told us," she said gently, not with anger, but with sadness and compassion. "You were protecting her memory and carrying this alone all these years." Elena nodded, unable to speak. The man then reached into his coat one last time and pulled out a recent photograph. He placed it beside the old one on the table. It showed a young woman in her late teens, smiling softly while holding a restored version of the same stuffed rabbit, carefully repaired but still recognizable. "She asked me to return this," he said quietly, sliding the photo toward Elena. "She said she wants the person who kept her safe memory alive to know she never forgot either." Elena stared at the photograph, her hands trembling as she reached for it. Tears streamed down her face as relief, grief, and peace collided inside her heart. The broken toy slipped slightly from her arms, landing softly in her lap. But as Mrs. Harrison leaned closer to examine the new photograph, her breath caught once more. In the background of the picture, standing slightly out of focus behind the smiling young woman, was someone familiar. Someone who appeared to be standing inside the Harrison mansion itself, captured unknowingly in the reflection of a hallway mirror, suggesting that Marisol's connection to their family and their home might not have ended as long ago as they believed. Mrs. Harrison leaned closer to the photograph, her heart pounding as she tried to focus on a reflection hidden in the hallway mirror. The image was slightly blurred, but the outline of a familiar hallway chandelier and part of their staircase was unmistakable. For a brief moment, confusion returned to the room. Mr. Harrison stepped beside her, narrowing his eyes as he examined the picture more carefully. "Are you sure this was taken recently?" he asked the man quietly. The man nodded. "It was taken about 3 months ago," he replied. "My daughter is part of a youth support program now. They organized a visit for her to reconnect with places that made her feel safe during childhood. She insisted on visiting this neighborhood. She never told me she stepped inside this house, but she stood outside for a long time, just looking at it." Mrs. Harrison felt a mix of surprise and emotion settle in her chest. She studied the reflection again, Realizing the familiar hallway might not mean Marisol had returned secretly, but simply that the photograph had been taken near the open front entrance during one of their charity events, when visitors were allowed into the foyer. The realization eased the last thread of tension that had lingered in her mind. Elena, still kneeling on the floor, held the photograph carefully as if it were made of glass. Her tears had softened into quiet relief. For years, she had carried guilt, believing she had failed to protect her niece and lost her forever. Now, seeing proof that Marisol was alive, safe, and remembering the kindness she once felt inside this home, seemed to lift the weight Elena had silently carried every single day she worked there. I always wondered if she hated me for losing her, Elena whispered softly. I thought keeping the broken toy was the only way to hold on to her memory. She never hated you, the man replied gently. She remembered you as the person who made her feel safe when everything else in her life felt uncertain. She asked me to find you and thank you for protecting that memory. Oliver slowly walked toward Elena and sat beside her on the floor. He gently touched the worn stuffed rabbit, now seeing it as more than just a childhood toy. Sophie joined them, carefully placing her small hand over Elena's shoulder. The simple gesture of comfort filled the room with warmth that replaced the heavy fear that had once surrounded the broken toy and its hidden story. Mr. Harrison cleared his throat softly, emotion showing through his normally calm voice. Elena, you've been part of this family for years. You never needed to carry this alone. Trust works both ways. Mrs. Harrison nodded, her eyes still moist with emotion. This home was already safe for our children, she said gently. But now I realize it also became a safe place for someone else who needed it. And that's something we're proud of, not ashamed of. Elena lowered her head, overwhelmed by the acceptance she had been too afraid to hope for. She carefully placed the broken stuffed rabbit on the table beside the photographs and the letter, no longer clutching out of fear, but holding it with quiet peace. The man smiled faintly, watching the moment unfold. My daughter asked if you would keep the toy, he said softly. She believes some memories belong where they were created. Mrs. Harrison picked up the rabbit and gently examined its worn stitching, the faded fabric, and the tiny initials that had sparked so many questions. She placed it carefully on a shelf in the playroom, beside Oliver and Sophie's childhood photos, giving it a place of honor rather than hiding away as something broken. In the following days, the Harrison home felt different in a quiet but meaningful way. The annual house cleaning continued, but this time, every item was handled with more care and thought. The family began to understand that not all broken things were meant to be thrown away. Some carried stories, memories, and emotional connections that shaped people's lives in ways no one could see at first glance. Elena returned to her daily routine, but her steps felt lighter, her smile more genuine. The secret that once filled her with fear had turned into a story of trust, loyalty, and emotional healing. The children often glanced at the shelf where the stuffed rabbit rested, now understanding that it represented kindness, protection, and the importance of holding on to meaningful memories. Sometimes, the strongest families aren't built by blood alone, but by moments of compassion, shared trust, and the courage to protect someone else's story. And in the Harrison home, a single broken toy quietly remained, reminding everyone that even the smallest objects can carry the power to change lives forever.